Peter Runfola. My Uncle Pete was insane. I know there was a proper medical term or a specific diagnosis for what he had, a sort of schizophrenia or something, but that knowledge died with my grandfather, who took care of Pete for most of his 60 or so years. It didn't even cross my mind, by the way, to write 60-odd. Pete died a few years before Grandpa, which is just as well. Grandpa Runfola was attuned to Pete's moods and rhythms. He could fend off an angry spell, quell daylight demons, and guide Pete through foggy fugues instinctively. They lived together, a divorcee and his huge, shaggy bachelor son, in College Park, Maryland. Their house was just blocks away from the house that Pete, his two brothers, and one sister, my mom, and at the time my still-married grandfather and grandmother grew up in. Well, no, not my grandfather and grandmother. They didn't grow up in that house, or anywhere, really. My grandfather and grandmother grew up separately, elsewhere. They collided in their youth, sent 4 kids flying into the world, and then continued on without each other. Except for Thanksgiving and Christmas, which were unspoken rally points in their solitary lives, when they'd get together with their 4 kids at either our house, one of the uncles, or, best of all, in my opinion, at Grandpa Runfola's. Other than that, it was a condo in Chevy Chase for Grandma and the little house in College Park for Grandpa and Uncle Pete. Grandpa's house in College Park was my favorite, so much better than Grandma's sterile Chevy Chase condo. At the condo, after dinner had been consumed, the adults were drawn in 2 directions. The men coalesced around sports on a television and short bumblebee bursts of travel to the wet bar. The women sat with them and gossiped about work, kids, and celebrities. It was the first musical mashup I can remember hearing, the headlong pulse of a football game, with the driving drone of the announcer's voice and the occasional whoop and bark of adults praising or condemning this or that, God damn that, or yes, or oh, shit. And then, laid over this, like gulls over a noisy summer beach of dropped hot dog bits and popcorn kernels, the women, who can't believe how stupid this one at work is, or horrible this one kid on the block is, or how can she stand to be photographed when she's so fat? A high treble of lip-smacking snark over the drum and bass of sports. My brother loved sports. I couldn't believe anyone could follow any conflict that didn't involve lasers, robots, or magic rings. I'd go out on the balcony and swoop up the crusty snow on the railings and drop it far, far, far into the empty courtyard. Uncle Pete would join me out there on the icy balcony. Not that he hated sports or even company. I assumed, at the time, he was the only other person who understood the inherent awesomeness of shattering ice sheets and plapping balls of soft snow on concrete which looked, from that perspective, like spells or evil presences smashing against the gray wall of reality, not getting through. What I didn't know was that Uncle Pete already had 100 songs and voices and movies and gods in his head, chattering and flirting and arguing in an eternal, overlit salon. It probably seemed rude to him to subject a group of job-holding, tax-paying, child-raising adults to such a cosmic and otherworldly standard. You wouldn't let Barney Fife go up against the Man with No Name or the Magnificent Seven, would you? We stood on the balcony, Uncle Pete and I. My breath came out in a clean fog in the winter air, and he exhaled an empty gray exhaust from the cigarettes he chain-smoked. Pete hadn't started growing his mad Russian priest beard. He wore thick horn-rimmed glasses. He had a square, clean-shaven face that looked like any number of people you'd see in the background of an early 50s group photo of a searching party. "Think you could hit those ravens with your snow bombs?" he asked, pointing down to a huddle of blackbirds on a branch 2 stories beneath us. "I could, but it'd be mean." "They'd bomb you if they could. That's what they're talking about now," he said, going back inside for another handful of the endless peanuts he used to wash down his cigarettes. I looked back down at the ravens, and as if they felt my gaze, they huddled together closer. I thought Pete was the coolest person in the world, and he lived in the coolest house ever. A little suburban bungalow perched on a corner off the highway with this weird backyard that swooped and rose, abutting other backyards that swooped and rose. Standing on the back porch, you looked out onto a stormy ocean of grass, flash-frozen at its angriest moment. Whoever designed College Park, Maryland, must have been quietly terrified of the landscape and left it untouched, as if the confused, dark, and ancient forces that carved the surface had signed it with an exclamation point. "Nevermore," said Pete, slamming himself down in the chair next to mine at the little kitchen table. I was laughing. He said "nevermore" in this weird TV horror movie host voice, and he bugged his eyes out. He had a thick book in front of him, and one of his thumbs was marking a page. "Quoth the raven," said Pete, and then, fumbling the book open, he started from the beginning of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. That was my first encounter with Poe, being read The Raven without preamble, introduction, or context by my insane uncle in a tiny kitchen in College Park. And he read it like a little kid discovering it, making a poem about adult regret and loneliness seem like the greatest thing to a kid who thought coolness acted like the Fonz, sounded like Kiss, and rode a motorcycle like Evel Knievel. My world was fun, but I always suspected there was more. Vampires in a room shuttered against California sunshine, a snow fort melted into the water that we swam in at the community pool in summer, heroes and villains created at the flick of a pencil tip or in the tumblings of a handful of dice. My parents could drive us to Washington, D.C. to get freeze-dried ice cream at the Air and Space Museum or ride the rides at King's Dominion or take us to movies. They could drop me off at an airport to take a plane trip to visit my other grandparents out in the Arizona desert. Still, the world felt bounded. Uncle Pete was the first one ever to heave open the gates that sealed ancient pages and make me suspect there were worlds within and without the world I was in, that there were worlds outside of the time I was living in. All of this he carried against his will, in his head, but unlike the other adults with their resentments and their anxiousness or anger, he seemed eternally, uncontrollably entertained. I really envied him. And then, before I knew it was happening, Pete became a living totem for everything I wanted to avoid in my life. I'm sitting here writing this, and I can't track the exact change, but it happened. I grew into my teens, and I grew afraid of awkwardness. Pete grew out his beard like he was God's cartoon and retreated farther and farther back into the thicket. And more than anyone in my family, and way more than anyone I've ever met or would become myself, he was comfortable and happy being quietly, antisocially, batshit crazy. Occasionally visiting Pete and Grandpa in my teen years forever soured me on the holy fool portrayals of the insane and eccentric in films. You know the ones I'm talking about, pale and unshaven, but always rakishly so, with a clowny glint of kooky wisdom in their eyes and an elliptical way of muttering hip-shot revelations the rest of us are ignoring, unaware of, or dancing around like some monstrous flame. Who can brave the shaman heat of the truth? Why, kooky Aunt Lottie, who wears earrings she made from toothbrushes and names all the squirrels. I'd be brooding about some teenage slight I'd conflated in my teenage mind, and Pete'd come into the kitchen. "You all right?" I'd say, sort of. Now here's Pete's chance to sort it all out. "That old lady in the commercial for the clapper? Someone should clap her in the face." No help. I began thinking of life, a real life, being about movement and travel and awareness, or at least I thought awareness came from seeing the world, experiencing it. I still think that. And that's where Pete and I parted ways, slowly and then all of a sudden. As the thicket closed its final branches around Pete's mind, he built a soundproof chamber in broad daylight. Out on the front porch of the little College Park house, he'd sit in his chair, sun up to sundown, and, truth be told, far beyond the darkness, and listen to the Washington, D.C. oldie station. They'd still take requests, and over the years, Pete became a minor celebrity, at least among the 6-strong crew of DJs who regularly took his calls for requests. The Elegant's Little Star was an abiding favorite. When winter came, he ran an extension cord from inside the house to a heating pad he'd sit on, baking his body like a mound of dough inside the clay oven of his winter parka. And coffee, endless cups of coffee, from the same chewed and bruised styrofoam cup from the 7-Eleven down the street. He'd bring it back, use it, until the edges of the bottom literally dissolved. Only then would he deign to grab a new one from next to the coffee pot. He would use a cup until it no longer existed as a cup. And there he'd sit. He was still lucid and relatively young, but I could imagine his features blurring and sliding beneath the beard. I could imagine his body sagging and spreading and creaking under the parka in winter and under his sail-like, oversized cotton shirts in the summer. Who knows what his mind was doing, raging and humming and slowing to a white crawl and then lurching forward in blue-hot bursts of mixed sound, memory, and random images. There was nothing in the eyes to tell you. When he spoke, it still related pretty lucidly to whatever or whomever was in front of him. If there were poison, dragons, or ghosts behind his greetings or goodbyes, I never saw it. I just saw my Uncle Pete sitting in place and knew that wasn't how I wanted to live my life. I suspected around the time I graduated college that were all versions of targets, fired at by indifferent events. If that was the case, then I wanted to be a moving target. What sealed my final, silent drifting away from Uncle Pete was a Christmas when we visited the College Park house. I was in the early stages of realizing I wanted to move to San Francisco to get serious about being a comedian. When you're beginning to suspect you might be leaving a place, you become hypersensitive to it, as if your mind is subconsciously stocking itself with smells, sounds, sights, and tactile sensations of a place you'll no longer see every day. So that Christmas, the one before I headed west, was a feast even before I sat down at the table. I can vividly remember the smell of the fireplace in my grandfather's basement, the feel of the fabric on his couch. Snow was visible, falling through the big glass doors in the back of the living room, and I remember how it made the white winter light ripple like seawater. I couldn't summon the illusion of the house rising through the air, but I tried, and I can taste every bit of that Thanksgiving by way of working-class Italian cuisine dinner. The turkey with a side of macaroni and peas, the rolls and roasted peppers, and the cheap jug wine, so sweet against the green bean and onion casserole. And I couldn't take my eyes off Pete. He ate dinner like he always did, in 3 or 4 huge, woofing bites, before heading back out front to his cone of warmth, his coffee, his cigarettes, and ghostly tunes piping from his little transistor radio. And most important, to whatever thoughts drowned out the voices of his own family saying hello and happy holidays. I watched him because I couldn't believe that could be anyone's comfortable horizon. A tiny porch on a dark corner near a highway. We lucked out living on a planet made thrilling by billions of years of chance, catastrophe, miracles, and disaster, and he'd rejected it. You're offered the world every morning when you open your eyes. I was beginning to see Pete as a representative of all the people who shut that out through cynicism, religion, fear, greed, or ritual. We were on our way home. My dad realized he needed to stop in the 7-Eleven for something. I went in with him. Another man was asking the clerk for directions, farther up the road from where we'd come. The clerk said, "Well, you keep heading back the way you were, right?" "Okay," said the man. "And you'll get to a corner about a mile up?" "Yeah." "And there's this house, and there's going to be a fat guy with a huge beard sitting out front listening to the radio. That's where you take your right." Pete had become a landmark. Pete died a few years after I'd moved to L.A. The chain-smoking, junk food, and immobility had finally gotten their message through to the rest of his body, and it quietly shut down. "Pete had his own little world there, you know," said my mom over the phone. At this point in my life, I'd traveled over 1/4 of the planet. I'd been to little towns and marveled at some random person, maybe a cineast who visited the same little movie theater in Prague every night, or a craggy bar denizen in Dublin who inhabited the same stool, or even the crazies in Los Angeles, dancing shirtless on the same stretch of sidewalk, holding up signs for the disinterested commuters to honk at. I was still hungry to travel and move and create and connect, and I always will be, but I've got to admit something. There's a little bit of Pete in me. There always was, and there always will be. Maybe it'll grow stronger as I grow older, maybe not, but it's there. I still don't agree with spending a life the way Pete did, but I understand it and respect it. Who knows how many lives have been saved and villains vanquished by those who sat still. Will anything we do last? No. I just read a quote by Sir David Rees. "Most educated people are aware that we are the outcome of nearly 4 billion years of Darwinian selection, but many tend to think that humans are somehow the culmination. Our sun, however, is less than halfway through its lifespan. It will not be humans who watch the sun's demise 6 billion years from now. Any creatures that exist will be as different from us as we are from bacteria or amoeba." On the day Pete died, someone left a fresh cup of coffee on his empty seat in front of the house in College Park. A nod from a fellow human who, like Pete, had started out as cosmic matter, shared with the stars above him, in an explosion eons ago. And long before Pete disintegrated out of this world, he'd become a happy ghost in his own heat-pad heaven, a paradise of tobacco, caffeine, and little star.